You're scrolling through social media when Charleston White's latest video pops up on your feed, and what he's saying about the D4vd case is so controversial it immediately goes viral and divides the entire internet. Charleston White, known for his provocative commentary on criminal justice cases and street culture, released a nearly hour-long video defending David Chen and claiming that Celeste had fabricated her entire story about being manipulated into providing a false alibi. The video was filmed in Charleston's typical confrontational style, with him speaking directly to the camera and making bold accusations that immediately sparked outrage across multiple platforms. Charleston's central argument was that Celeste's story about being manipulated didn't make sense, and that she had likely been a willing participant in providing the alibi, who only came forward when she realized she might face legal consequences. He questioned why an intelligent woman would agree to lie for someone without asking more questions about why the alibi was needed. According to Charleston, Celeste's claim of being deceived was a calculated move to avoid prosecution rather than a genuine confession motivated by guilt. The video included Charleston's analysis of the timeline, pointing out what he claimed were inconsistencies in Celeste's account of when she realized she had been manipulated. He argued that her delayed disclosure proved she had been complicit all along, and only changed her story when it became advantageous to do so. Charleston suggested that prosecutors had pressured her into testifying against David by threatening charges unless she cooperated, making her testimony unreliable and potentially coerced. Charleston went further by questioning the physical evidence presented at trial, claiming that DNA evidence could be explained by innocent contact and that surveillance footage was too unclear to definitively identify anyone. He argued that the prosecution had built their case on circumstantial evidence and the testimony of a witness who had admitted to lying, creating reasonable doubt that the jury should have considered. According to Charleston, David's conviction represented a miscarriage of justice driven by public pressure to convict someone for a high-profile crime. Most controversially, Charleston suggested that Celeste might have had her own reasons for wanting to frame David, though he was vague about what those reasons might be. He implied there could be a relationship between Celeste and the actual perpetrator, or that she might have been involved in the kidnapping herself, and used David as a scapegoat. The accusations were presented without evidence, but stated with enough confidence that his followers began spreading the theories as though they were established facts. Charleston's video included attacks on Celeste's character, describing her as manipulative and attention-seeking. He claimed she was enjoying the sympathy and media attention she received for coming forward, and that her emotional displays during testimony were performances designed to gain public support. The personal attacks on someone who had been manipulated by a convicted criminal struck many observers as cruel and irresponsible, but Charleston's supporters defended his right to question the narrative presented at trial. The response to Charleston's video was immediate and polarized. His supporters flooded social media with posts defending David and attacking Celeste, using hashtags that trended within hours of the video's release. They shared Charleston's talking points about inconsistencies in Celeste's story and questioned why people were so quick to believe her account. The movement created by Charleston's video represented a significant faction of people who believed David had been wrongly convicted. Critics of Charleston's video were equally vocal, accusing him of spreading dangerous misinformation and attacking a victim of manipulation for content and attention. They pointed out that his analysis ignored testimony from psychological experts about how manipulation works and dismissed the substantial physical evidence that had been presented at trial. Legal experts who reviewed Charleston's claims found them to be based on misunderstandings of how evidence works and selective presentation of facts that supported his predetermined conclusion. Now people are wondering, when controversial influencers spread theories that contradict court verdicts and attack witnesses, what responsibility do they have for the real-world consequences of their content? Charleston White's defense of David didn't stop with his initial video. He doubled down over the following days with multiple follow-up posts, interviews, and live streams where he expanded on his theories and responded to critics who challenged his analysis of the case. The continued coverage kept the controversy alive and brought more attention to his claims about David's innocence and Celeste's supposed deception. In a live stream that attracted tens of thousands of viewers, Charleston engaged with critics in real time, defending his position and attacking people who disagreed with him. He characterized those who believed Celeste's testimony as naive people who accepted whatever narrative they were fed without critical thinking. Charleston positioned himself as someone willing to ask difficult questions and challenge popular opinions, framing his controversial stance as intellectual independence rather than irresponsible speculation. Charleston invited other content creators who shared his skepticism about David's conviction to appear on his platform, creating a network of voices questioning the case. These collaborators analyzed trial transcripts, discussed legal procedures, and developed increasingly elaborate theories about what really happened that contradicted the prosecution's case and the jury's verdict. The collaborative content creation gave Charleston's position more apparent credibility by presenting multiple people reaching similar conclusions. The community that formed around Charleston's defense of David began conducting their own investigations into Celeste's background, looking for anything that might undermine her credibility. They searched through her social media history, contacted people who knew her, and compiled information they believed proved she was dishonest or had questionable character. The crowdsourced investigation crossed ethical lines as strangers dug into a private citizen's life looking for ammunition to discredit her testimony. Charleston's followers began targeting Celeste directly with messages questioning her story and accusing her of lying. The volume of negative attention was overwhelming and frightening for someone who had already been through significant trauma. Messages ranged from questions demanding she explain perceived inconsistencies to outright threats and harassment. The coordinated campaign appeared designed to punish Celeste for testifying against David and to discourage others from coming forward in similar situations. The harassment extended beyond Celeste to include her family members, friends, and supporters who defended her publicly. Anyone who vouched for Celeste's credibility or criticized Charleston's analysis became a target for his followers. The expansion of harassment to include peripheral figures created a chilling effect where people became reluctant to publicly support Celeste out of fear they would become the next target of coordinated online attacks. Charleston's content about the case took on increasingly conspiratorial tones as he suggested that law enforcement, prosecutors, and media had all been involved in framing David. He implied that the system was corrupt and that David's conviction served some unstated agenda beyond simple justice. The conspiracy theories were vague on specifics but effective at creating doubt among his audience about whether any official narrative could be trusted. Media outlets covering Charleston's involvement in the case faced difficult decisions about how to address his claims. Some chose to report on the controversy he created while fact-checking his specific allegations and providing context about why his analysis was flawed. Others declined to cover his content at all, arguing that amplifying his reach only served to spread misinformation and cause additional harm to Celeste and her family. The different approaches reflected broader debates about how to handle influential figures who spread misinformation. Legal experts and criminal justice advocates expressed concern that Charleston's content was undermining public trust in the justice system and potentially endangering witnesses in other cases. They warned that attacking witnesses who come forward with truthful testimony, even when it contradicts earlier false statements made under manipulation, could discourage cooperation in future investigations. The chilling effect could make it harder to solve crimes and hold perpetrators accountable if witnesses feared they would be targeted for changing their stories. The controversy revealed divisions within communities about how to evaluate criminal cases and what sources of information to trust. Charleston's supporters tended to be skeptical of law enforcement and the justice system, predisposed to believe that official narratives were potentially corrupt or misleading. His critics generally maintained more trust in institutional processes like trials and jury verdicts, while being skeptical of influencers who profit from controversy. When someone with a large platform spreads theories that contradict jury verdicts and targets witnesses for harassment, where is the line between free speech and dangerous misinformation? The impact of Charleston White's campaign on Celeste's family was profound and immediate, particularly for her mother, who had been her primary support system throughout the trauma of realizing she had been manipulated and the difficulty of coming forward with the truth. The public attacks on her daughter's credibility and character took a severe toll on her mental health. Celeste's mother, Patricia Morgan, had already been struggling with anxiety and guilt about not recognizing that David was manipulating her daughter. She blamed herself for not being more protective and questioned whether she should have seen warning signs that her daughter was being groomed for exploitation. The existing mental health challenges were dramatically exacerbated when Charleston's followers began targeting Celeste with harassment and threats based on his accusations that she was lying. Patricia described experiencing panic attacks when reading the messages her daughter was receiving from Charleston's followers. Seeing strangers attack Celeste's character and accuse her of fabricating her victimization was devastating for a mother who had watched her daughter struggle with genuine trauma. The attacks felt like a continuation of the harm David had caused, as though Celeste was being victimized repeatedly by people who refused to accept that manipulation could be as sophisticated as it had been in her case. The stress manifested physically for Patricia with symptoms including insomnia, loss of appetite, and stress-related illness that required medical attention. Her doctor diagnosed her with acute stress disorder and prescribed medication to help manage the symptoms, but Patricia struggled with the reality that medication could only do so much when the source of stress continued daily. Every new video Charleston posted or wave of harassment Celeste received created fresh anxiety that prevented healing. Patricia's relationship with social media changed dramatically as she found herself unable to avoid seeing attacks on her daughter, even when she tried to disconnect. Well-meaning friends and family members would alert her to particularly vicious posts or concerning threats, keeping her in a state of hypervigilance even when she attempted to step back. The inability to protect her daughter from the onslaught of public attacks created feelings of helplessness that compounded her depression. The family considered legal action against Charleston for defamation or incitement of harassment, consulting with attorneys about what remedies might be available. The legal analysis was discouraging. While Charleston's accusations were false and damaging, the legal standards for defamation were high, particularly when the target was someone who had become a public figure through their involvement in a criminal case. The attorneys warned that pursuing legal action might generate even more attention and harassment, creating a difficult calculation about whether fighting back would help or hurt. Patricia's mental health struggles affected her ability to function in daily life and maintain her job. She found herself unable to concentrate at work, frequently calling in sick when the stress became overwhelming. Her employer was initially supportive, but the extended absences created professional consequences that added financial stress to the emotional burden. The cascading effects of the harassment demonstrated how attacks on one family member affected everyone connected to them. Therapy became crucial for Patricia's survival during this period. But even therapy had limitations when the trauma was ongoing rather than a past event to process. Her therapist helped her develop coping strategies for managing anxiety and provided support for processing the complicated emotions around her daughter's situation. However, the therapist acknowledged that healing would be difficult as long as the public attacks continued, and Celeste remained in danger from Charleston's followers. The impact on Patricia's relationship with Celeste was complex. Patricia wanted to be strong and supportive for her daughter, but her own mental health struggles sometimes meant Celeste felt she had to care for her mother rather than the other way around. Both women were suffering from different aspects of the same situation, and their mutual support was genuine but sometimes insufficient for the magnitude of what they were experiencing. Family therapy helped them navigate the complicated dynamics and avoid blaming each other for pain that was caused by external forces. Patricia connected with other parents whose children had been victimized and then subjected to public disbelief or attacks, finding some comfort in shared experience. Support groups for families dealing with similar situations provided space to process emotions with people who understood the unique pain of watching your child be attacked for telling the truth. The connections didn't eliminate Patricia's suffering, but provided some relief from the isolation that came with such a specific form of trauma. The toll on Patricia's mental health illustrated the broader harm caused when controversial influencers target witnesses and victims in criminal cases. The damage wasn't limited to the primary target, but rippled through families and support networks, affecting multiple people's well-being and ability to function. The realization that protecting her daughter also meant protecting herself created difficult choices about how much to engage with the controversy versus attempting to withdraw for self-preservation. When a mother watches her daughter be publicly attacked and threatened based on lies spread by someone with a massive platform, how does she protect both her daughter and her own mental health while feeling powerless to stop the harm? Celeste's family reached a breaking point when they decided they needed to respond publicly to Charleston White's accusations. The decision was agonizing because they knew responding might draw more attention and harassment, but remaining silent felt like allowing lies to stand unchallenged and abandoning Celeste to face the attacks alone. The family held a press conference with their attorney present, where Patricia and Celeste's father spoke about the impact of Charleston's campaign on their family. Patricia's statement was emotional and powerful, describing the mental health toll of watching strangers attack her daughter based on misinformation. She emphasized that Celeste had been victimized first by David's manipulation and was now being victimized again by people who refused to accept that sophisticated manipulation could deceive intelligent people. Patricia directly addressed Charleston White during her statement, asking him to consider the real-world consequences of his content. She explained that his accusations had generated death threats against her daughter and created fear for their family's safety. She begged him to think about whether his need for controversial content was worth the harm he was causing to people who were already suffering. The emotional appeal was genuine and heartbreaking, though it remained uncertain whether it would have any impact on Charleston's behavior. Celeste's father provided a more analytical response to Charleston's specific claims, systematically addressing the alleged inconsistencies in Celeste's story that Charleston had highlighted. He explained how Charleston had misunderstood or misrepresented facts from the case to support his predetermined conclusion. The detailed rebuttal was thorough, but required nuanced understanding that might not be accessible to people who had already accepted Charleston's simpler narrative. The family's attorney addressed the legal aspects of Charleston's content, explaining that while they were exploring legal options, the standards for defamation made it challenging to pursue. The attorney emphasized that just because something was legal didn't mean it was ethical or responsible, and called on platform companies to consider their role in amplifying content that targeted vulnerable individuals with harassment. The statement about legal limitations was honest, but disappointing for those hoping the family could use the legal system to stop Charleston. The press conference included supporters of Celeste who provided additional perspective on her character and the genuine trauma she had experienced. Friends described watching Celeste struggle with guilt and anxiety after realizing she had been manipulated, contradicting Charleston's portrayal of her as someone seeking attention and sympathy. The testimonials humanized Celeste and challenged the narrative that she was a manipulative liar. Though whether they would persuade Charleston's followers remained doubtful, the family released a statement from Celeste herself, carefully crafted with input from her therapist and attorney. In it, she acknowledged that she understood why some people might have questions about her story, but emphasized that the jury had heard all the evidence and expert testimony about manipulation before convicting David. She asked people to consider whether they were truly evaluating evidence objectively or whether they were being influenced by a controversial influencer's desire for engagement and attention. The media coverage of the family's response was extensive but divided along predictable lines. Outlets that had been critical of Charleston amplified the family's statements and provided sympathetic coverage of their suffering. Platforms more aligned with Charleston's skepticism of institutions framed the response as an attempt to silence questions and shut down legitimate debate about the case. The divided coverage meant that people's interpretation of the press conference largely depended on what sources they trusted. Charleston's response to the family's press conference was dismissive and doubled down on his original claims. He characterized the family's emotional appeals as manipulation tactics designed to shut down legitimate questions about inconsistencies in Celeste's story. He argued that crying didn't prove someone was telling the truth, and that he wouldn't be intimidated into silence by attempts to paint him as the villain for asking questions. His response energized his followers while horrifying his critics. The back and forth between Charleston and Celeste's family became its own ongoing story that overshadowed the original case in some media coverage. The meta-narrative about influencer responsibility and the impact of online harassment threatened to eclipse the actual facts of David's crimes and conviction. Some observers argued this was exactly what Charleston wanted: to center himself in the story and profit from controversy regardless of the harm caused to the actual victims. Mental health advocates used the situation to highlight the inadequacy of support systems for people targeted by online harassment campaigns. Celeste and her family were experiencing severe psychological harm but had limited resources for protection or recourse. The advocacy focused on both the need for better platform policies against harassment and the importance of mental health support for victims of coordinated online attacks. When a family tries to defend themselves against false accusations from an influential figure and his followers, but their response only generates more attention and harassment, what are they supposed to do to protect themselves? The community response to the conflict between Charleston White and Celeste's family revealed deep divisions about how to evaluate criminal cases and what role influencers should play in commenting on jury verdicts. The public discourse became as much about trust in institutions versus trust in independent commentators as it was about the specific facts of David's case. Social media platforms became battlegrounds where Charleston's supporters and Celeste's defenders argued about everything from the reliability of DNA evidence to the nature of manipulation and coercive control. The debates were often heated and personal, with both sides accusing the other of being naive, biased, or complicit in injustice. The polarization made productive conversation nearly impossible as people became more entrenched in their positions rather than genuinely considering alternative perspectives. True crime content creators faced pressure to take positions on the controversy, with their audiences demanding they either support Charleston's questioning of the verdict or condemn his treatment of Celeste. Some creators tried to stake out middle ground by acknowledging that questions about cases were legitimate while criticizing Charleston's tactics and attacks on Celeste's character. The nuanced positions satisfied almost no one, as both sides wanted clear declarations of allegiance. Legal professionals and criminal justice experts overwhelmingly sided against Charleston's analysis, providing detailed explanations of why his claims about the case were based on misunderstandings of evidence and procedure. Bar associations and legal education organizations used the controversy as a teaching moment about how misinformation about the justice system spreads, and why legal conclusions require careful analysis rather than surface-level reactions to selective facts. The educational efforts reached some people but largely preached to those already inclined to trust institutional expertise. Victim advocacy organizations issued statements condemning Charleston's campaign and emphasizing the harm caused when witnesses who come forward are attacked and threatened. The organizations highlighted that Charleston's tactics would make victims and witnesses in other cases more reluctant to cooperate with investigations out of fear they would face similar treatment. The statements from advocacy groups carried weight with people already concerned about victim rights but had little impact on Charleston's core audience. The controversy attracted attention from researchers studying online radicalization and conspiracy theory development. Charleston's technique of questioning official narratives while providing alternative explanations that required increasingly elaborate conspiracy theories to sustain followed patterns seen in other contexts. The research perspective helped explain why debunking specific claims was ineffective. People weren't arriving at conclusions through evidence evaluation, but rather through identity and trust factors that made them receptive to anti-institutional narratives. Some community leaders attempted to mediate the conflict by reaching out to both Charleston and Celeste's family to facilitate dialogue. The mediation efforts were largely unsuccessful as the positions were too entrenched and the harm too severe for productive conversation. Charleston showed no interest in retracting or softening his claims, while Celeste's family understandably had no desire to engage with someone who they believed was deliberately causing them harm for profit and attention. The platform companies hosting Charleston's content faced pressure from advocacy groups to remove or restrict his videos about the case, with arguments that they violated policies against harassment or dangerous misinformation. The company's responses varied, with some removing specific videos that contained direct threats or harassment, while leaving up content that expressed opinions about the case. The inconsistent enforcement created frustration across the spectrum. Charleston's supporters saw it as censorship, while his critics argued the platforms weren't doing enough to prevent harm. The controversy expanded to include debates about content creator responsibility and whether platforms should implement stricter policies about commentary on ongoing or recently concluded criminal cases. Some argued that influencers should face consequences for spreading false information about cases where lives and safety were at stake. Others maintained that open discussion and questioning of verdicts was important for justice, and that restricting speech would create worse problems than the current situation. Black community leaders found themselves in difficult positions as Charleston had cultivated an audience within their communities by speaking on issues they cared about. Some leaders felt obligated to denounce his treatment of Celeste, while acknowledging his other work. Others struggled with not wanting to criticize a prominent Black voice even when they disagreed with his stance. The complexity reflected broader tensions about accountability and solidarity within communities. The division created by the controversy extended into Celeste's personal life as she discovered that some people she had considered friends, or at least friendly acquaintances, had been influenced by Charleston's content. Learning that people she knew personally had doubts about her testimony was devastating and contributed to her isolation and trauma. The discovery that the propaganda had reached her own circles made it impossible to feel safe anywhere. When a controversial influencer creates such deep divisions in communities that even the victim's own circles question her credibility, what does that reveal about the power of influential figures to shape reality for their audiences regardless of actual facts? As weeks passed, and Charleston White continued his campaign, while Celeste's family struggled to cope with ongoing harassment, the broader implications of the situation for influencer accountability and platform responsibility became clearer. The case became a focal point for debates about what guardrails should exist around content that targets individuals involved in criminal cases. Platform policy analysts examined Charleston's content to determine whether it violated existing community guidelines against harassment, misinformation, or incitement of violence. The analysis revealed that Charleston had been sophisticated in staying just within the boundaries of what platforms allowed, avoiding explicit calls for violence or direct threats while creating content that predictably generated harassment from followers. The plausible deniability built into his content made enforcement difficult even when the harmful intent seemed obvious. Legal experts explored whether Celeste and her family had any viable legal recourse beyond the defamation claims that appeared difficult to pursue. They examined whether Charleston's content constituted intentional infliction of emotional distress, whether the platform companies could be held liable for facilitating harassment, and whether any criminal statutes about witness intimidation might apply. The legal landscape was complex and mostly unfavorable for the family, reflecting how law had not kept pace with the realities of online harassment. Mental health professionals working with Celeste and her family documented the severe psychological toll of sustained public attacks, creating a record that might be useful in future policy discussions or potential legal actions. The documentation showed measurable harm, including diagnosed anxiety disorders, depression, PTSD symptoms, and physical manifestations of chronic stress. The evidence made clear that the harm from Charleston's campaign was not merely hurt feelings but genuine psychological injury with lasting consequences. Advocacy organizations began developing model policies they hoped platforms would adopt regarding commentary on criminal cases and individuals involved in them. The proposals attempted to balance free speech interests with protection of vulnerable individuals, suggesting restrictions on content that contained false factual claims about cases, that explicitly encouraged harassment, or that revealed private information about witnesses or victims. The policy development process revealed how difficult it was to craft rules that would prevent harm without creating their own injustices. Charleston's continued content about the case evolved to include criticisms of the calls for him to be deplatformed or restricted, which he characterized as censorship in attempts to silence Black voices who questioned institutional narratives. He positioned himself as a victim of cancel culture and claimed that attempts to limit his speech proved that powerful forces didn't want the truth about David's case to be examined. The framing was effective with his core audience even as it infuriated his critics who saw it as manipulation. Some of Charleston's sponsors and business partners faced pressure from activists demanding they cut ties with him due to his treatment of Celeste and her family. A few companies quietly ended their relationships with Charleston, while others maintained their partnerships while issuing statements that their business relationships didn't constitute endorsement of all content. The incomplete accountability frustrated advocates who wanted to see more severe consequences for what they viewed as irresponsible and harmful content creation. The controversy prompted broader discussions about the economics of online content creation and how profit incentives encourage controversial content that generated engagement regardless of harm. Charleston's subscriber counts and video views increased during the controversy, meaning his attacks on Celeste were literally profitable for him. The perverse incentive structure made it unlikely he would change behavior that was being financially rewarded, even as it caused measurable harm to vulnerable people. Media literacy organizations used the situation as a case study in how to evaluate online content critically, teaching people to consider what incentives creators have, what evidence they're presenting versus what they're claiming, and what real-world consequences might result from accepting their narratives. The educational efforts were important, but faced the challenge that the people most in need of media literacy training were often least likely to seek it out or receptive to it. Celeste's mental health continued to deteriorate under the sustained pressure, leading her treatment team to consider whether she needed more intensive intervention. The discussion of potential hospitalization reflected how severe the situation had become and how inadequate existing support systems were for someone in her position. The family faced the awful reality that protecting Celeste might require removing her from all online presence and public life, essentially letting Charleston's campaign succeed in silencing her. The case attracted attention from academics studying the intersection of social media, justice system, and public opinion formation. Research projects were initiated to examine how influencer commentary on criminal cases affected public perception, whether there were measurable impacts on juror behavior in subsequent cases, and what interventions might be effective at countering misinformation. The academic attention was valuable for long-term understanding, but provided little immediate help to Celeste and her family. When influencer content creates documented psychological harm to individuals but remains within the technical boundaries of platform policies and legal liability, what responsibility do platforms, sponsors, and audiences bear for the consequences of content they enable, support, or consume? Months after Charleston White's initial defense of David and his attacks on Celeste began, the situation reached a kind of exhausted equilibrium, where Charleston had moved on to other controversies while Celeste and her family continued dealing with the lasting consequences of his campaign. The resolution was unsatisfying and incomplete, reflecting the reality that online harassment campaigns rarely have clean endings. Charleston's content about the David case gradually decreased as his attention shifted to other topics that could generate engagement and controversy. He never retracted his claims about David's innocence or apologized to Celeste for the harassment his content generated. Occasionally, he would reference the case in passing, reinforcing his position without dedicating full content to it. The reduced attention was a relief for Celeste's family, but didn't undo the harm that had been done. Celeste's recovery from the compounded trauma of David's manipulation and Charleston's campaign was slow and difficult. She continued intensive therapy and gradually rebuilt some capacity to function in daily life, but the experience had fundamentally changed her sense of safety and trust. The hypervigilance and anxiety developed during the harassment would likely persist for years, affecting her relationships, career prospects, and overall quality of life. The lasting harm was immeasurable and irreversible in many ways. Patricia's mental health stabilized somewhat as the immediate crisis subsided, but she continued to struggle with anxiety and depression related to what her family had experienced. The trauma of watching her daughter be victimized repeatedly while feeling powerless to protect her left psychological scars that would require ongoing therapeutic work. Her relationship with social media remained complicated as she tried to balance staying informed with protecting her mental health from potential triggers. The family's relationship with the justice system and law enforcement was complicated by the experience. While they appreciated that David had been convicted and were satisfied with that outcome, the failure of the system to protect Celeste from the aftermath of her testimony felt like another betrayal. They became advocates for better protections for witnesses and victims who came forward in criminal cases, working with organizations pushing for policy changes that might prevent others from experiencing similar harassment. The broader impact of the controversy on public discourse about criminal cases was mixed. Some people became more aware of how influencer commentary could be harmful and misleading, while others became more entrenched in skepticism about institutional narratives. The polarization that the controversy reflected and reinforced persisted, with little indication that meaningful dialogue across divisions was possible. The case became another data point in broader cultural battles about trust, expertise, and whose voices should be considered authoritative. Platform policies evolved slightly in response to the case and others like it, with some companies implementing stricter rules about content targeting individuals involved in criminal cases. The changes were incremental and inconsistently enforced, reflecting the difficulty platforms faced in balancing competing values of free expression and user protection. Advocacy groups continued pushing for more comprehensive reforms while civil liberties organizations warned against overreach that might stifle legitimate commentary. The question of accountability for Charleston remained contentious. His supporters continued to view him as someone willing to ask difficult questions and challenge narratives, while his critics saw him as a bad actor who profited from causing harm. The lack of consequences for his treatment of Celeste frustrated many, but reflected the reality that the systems for holding influencers accountable were underdeveloped and inadequate for addressing the new forms of harm that online platforms enabled. Celeste's advocacy work, when she felt capable of engaging in it, focused on educating people about manipulation tactics and the compounded trauma of being victimized both by criminals and by those who refused to believe victims. She occasionally spoke about how Charleston's campaign had affected her, using her experience to illustrate the real-world consequences of irresponsible influencer content. The work was healing for her in some ways, while also requiring her to repeatedly relive painful experiences. The relationship between Charleston's content and David's case became a case study in law schools and journalism programs about the ethics of public commentary on criminal cases. Students examined what responsibilities commentators had to accuracy, what harm their content might cause, and how to balance free speech principles with protection of vulnerable individuals. The educational use of the case meant that Celeste's pain served some larger purpose, though that was cold comfort. The final assessment of the situation was that the justice system had worked as intended in convicting David based on solid evidence, but the adjacent systems for protecting witnesses and preventing harassment had failed catastrophically. Celeste had done the right thing by coming forward with the truth, but the consequences she faced for that decision were severe enough to potentially discourage others from similar cooperation in the future. The failure represented a crisis for justice that extended beyond individual cases. As time passed, Celeste and her family adapted to their new reality while carrying the weight of what they had experienced. They found moments of peace and healing while knowing that complete recovery might never be possible. Their story illustrated the hidden costs of justice and the gaps in systems meant to protect those who cooperate with law enforcement. When doing the right thing results in trauma that lasts years and affects every aspect of your life, while the person who caused that harm faces no real consequences, what does that reveal about the protection our systems offer to those who tell difficult truths?